That Wednesday, August 14th, 1974, dawned clear and scorching in the heart of the Chihuahuan Desert. At 7:30 in the morning, Clara Dominic Botley and Pablo Ferrer Gomez, two young Catalan tourists aged 25 and 27 respectively, left Villa Humada aboard a navy blue 1972 Toyota Land Cruiser. Rented weeks earlier in El Paso, they had planned to camp for 3 days in the semi-virgin region of Devil's Canyon, a vast expanse of rock formations, plains, and half-made dirt roads that stretches between the northern border of Chihuahua and the first foothills of southern Texas. That morning, Clara reviewed the route for the last time in her brown leather notebook, highlighting the access to the canyon via an unmarked detour at kilometer 142 of Federal Highway 2. It was the final stage of a long journey crisscrossed with maps and analog photography that had begun 45 days earlier in Tijuana and had taken them smoothly along secondary roads and small towns to the gateway to the desert. They stopped briefly to refuel at a Polite station on the way out of Villa Ahumada. Pablo got out first, asked to fill up the tank and check the condition of the tires, while Clara bought ice, sliced bread, and a bottle of cheap gin for the evening. The clerk, who would remember Clara's face decades later with a clarity that would haunt her dreams, said that she smiled sweetly, asked if the ice was drinkable, and wrote everything down in her notebook. Pablo paid in cash, thanked her with a brief gesture, and they both got back into the vehicle without further ado. No one else saw them after that. The area chosen for camping, according to the last written itinerary found months later in an unsent letter, was known for its dry canyons, basalt walls, and ancient water extraction wells. Access involved leaving the asphalt and following a barely visible track that wound through a dusty hill. There was no signage, no cover, no human trace other than the scattered remains of rusty barbed wire and the occasional tire track hardened in the ground. During the afternoon, satellite and meteorological records indicate that temperatures exceeded 43 degrees Celsius. However, there were no sandstorms or emergency reports. For any regular traveler in the region, that would have been a calm, relentless day, one of those that the desert delivers without warning. When Clara's family notified the Spanish consulate general in Ciudad Juarez of her absence a week later, local authorities filed the case as a disappearance not attributable to a third party. The initial hypothesis was that they had become disoriented, suffered a mechanical failure, or died from exposure. But neither the vehicle was located, nor were any remains camp, clothing, or tire tracks found in the vicinity. No body, no compass, no sign, just the still, thick air and a memoryless heat. Little by little, the case became blurred between poorly written files, unfounded suspicions, and institutional silence. Neither Mexico nor the United States reopened the search after the first 90 days. In October of that year, a local newspaper published a short article entitled, "Two Europeans Vanish in the North Without a Photograph or Follow-Up." The Earth, as always, kept it secret, and the patient desert sealed it with sand. The first attempts to locate Clara and Pablo vanished with a speed as sharp as the landscape that saw them disappear. Clara's family from Barcelona pressured the consulate to intervene more firmly with the Mexican authorities, but diplomatic channels were met with thick and disinterested bureaucracy. The case, with no bodies, no vehicle, and no witnesses other than the last gas station attendant, was classified as a disappearance without criminal elements, and the investigation file was closed in December 1974 due to a lack of conclusive evidence. The final report was no more than 10 pages long. In Mexico, disappearances in rural areas of the North were frequent, and unless they involved local citizens of political or economic importance, they rarely prompted thorough investigations. In the eyes of the press, the young Europeans had made the mistake of venturing down unknown routes without a guide, without connections, and without the necessary knowledge to survive in terrain as hostile as the border desert. The official story pointed to an accident, a mechanical failure, a slow and anonymous dehydration, nothing more. But in Barcelona, Clara's mother refused to close the wound. Every year without fail, he wrote a letter to the Spanish foreign delegation, asking for the case to be reopened. I received generic responses, often with wrong dates and misspelled names. In 1983, after the death of Clara's father, She began a silent campaign sending leaflets and photographs to Mexican media, religious organizations, local radio stations, and even parishes in northern Mexico, hoping to find some lost testimony. No one responded. The image of Clara with her mustard scarf was archived among hundreds of missing faces that no one investigated in depth in those years. On the U.S. side, the case was never formally opened. Since there was no indication that the couple had crossed the border and no direct complaint was filed with U.S. agencies, no personnel were assigned to the case. The Texas authorities simply responded that there was no record of immigration entry after the last known location in Mexican territory. During the following decades, rumors emerged sporadically. A local guide claimed to have seen a similar-looking foreign couple near Sierra Vieja in the fall of 1975. But his statement was not recorded in writing. A long-haul truck driver claimed to have found a backpack containing a Spanish passport on a deserted stretch of road toward Ojinaga, but he never provided the object, nor was he able to describe it. An anonymous letter arrived at the consulate in 1989, stating that the girl with the yellow scarf was still in the Devil's Well, but it was filed away without any follow-up. None of those leads were confirmed. Most of them were the result of suggestion, rural fear, or vague forgetfulness. The investigation was drowning in the sands of time. In 1995, Pablo and Clara were removed from Interpol's active list of missing persons. Their names remained, yes, but marked with a dry note: inactive case. By then, in the physical archives of the Spanish consulate in Ciudad Juarez, the folder lay dormant on the bottom shelf, under a layer of dust and resignation. Neither the emerging technology of the 1990s nor the growing interest of the European media in the missing in Latin America altered their status. Clara and Pablo became what the desert best knows how to create: an absence without form, a story without an end, a photograph without a caption. Only their mothers, because Pablo's mother also wrote to Spanish journalists and congressmen for years, continued to repeat their names in low voices, like someone clinging to a word before the world forgets it. And yet the desert does not forget. It only waits under the sand. What was buried hardens, transforms, remains. And when the wind stops, the earth sometimes returns what silence believed to be eternal. On the morning of Monday, June 6, 2005, geological engineer Hector Samaripa Ruiz stopped at kilometer 142 of Federal Highway 2 in an arid, unmarked strip 11 kilometers from the border between Chihuahua and Texas. Accompanied by two technical assistants, he was evaluating the terrain for a future solar energy project promoted by a German firm that intended to install photovoltaic panels on that inclement plain. The day was passing uneventfully until one of the young men, in charge of topographic measurements, tripped over an unevenness in the ground. A rusty metal cover, partially covered by gravel and dried weeds, which rudimentarily sealed what appeared to be the mouth of an ancient well. Tamarpa, experienced in tracing inactive extraction wells, immediately identified the remains of a forgotten structure. The circular edge of broken concrete and signs of recent tampering, chaotically coiled barbed wire, and a loose sheet of riveted steel seemed unusual to him. He ordered the area to be cleared, and when the cover was removed, a sour, dry, almost imperceptible but persistent smell emerged. There was no water inside, just a column of darkness and dust. They threw a stone. The late muffled sound of the drop confirmed that the depth was exceeded when they were about to record the location. The youngest assistant, an environmental engineering intern, stepped back a few feet to take a photograph of the whole thing. During that short trip, something caught his attention. Next to a thorny bush half buried among black stones, a small metallic object appeared, covered in a layer of dust and rust. He picked it up with gloves, still not understanding its significance. It was a broken pocket compass with the lid torn off at a hinge and a crudely punched engraving on the inside surface. The discovery was immediately reported to the project manager, who in turn notified Civil Protection. Within 24 hours, the Northern Chihuahua District Attorney's Office ordered a preliminary inspection, and the following day a rescue team descended the well. What they found left no room for doubt. Human socio-fragments mixed with organic debris, scraps of fabric attached to scattered ribs, a sports shoe with a worn sole, and a curved metal piece that would later be identified as part of a rusty iron lever. The detonating object, the Swiss Altus Model 58 compass, was sent to a forensic laboratory in the city of Chihuahua for analysis of biological traces. Under ultraviolet light, experts detected dark stains on the inside of the lid, traces of dried blood still preserved. A sample was taken with a swab and sent for genetic comparison. The plaque with the initials PFG, although rudimentary, turned out to be a key clue. The updated online archive of missing persons, interconnected with international platforms since the early 2000s, made it possible to find a match in less than 48 hours. Pablo Ferrer Gomez, a Spanish citizen who disappeared in Chihuahua with his partner in 1974, appeared in an old Interpol database with a supplementary file issued by the Spanish consular office in Ciudad Juarez. Clara's mother, who had never stopped sending updates to the Ministry of the Interior, had kept the consular record current, including photographs, physical descriptions, previous fingerprints, and copies of personal belongings. Among them was a gift that Clara had given Pablo the day they began their journey, a Swiss-made compass with his initials hand-engraved. The discovery took on a new dimension. What initially appeared to be an archaeological or agricultural discovery turned into an active criminal case. The news spread among prosecutors, diplomats, and forensic experts. In less than a week, the silence of 3 decades was broken by a piece of metal just 7 centimeters long. The case was officially reopened on June 10, 2005, when the Chihuahua State Attorney General's office requested support from the Missing Persons Search Unit and the newly created State Center for Human Identification to begin a full forensic investigation. The discovery site was cordoned off for several days, while careful excavations were carried out around the perimeter of the pit. Under layers of hardened sand, the experts located additional bone fragments, a right femur, several scattered vertebrae, part of a skull with traumatic depression, and numerous pieces of fabric that, after further analysis, were identified as coming from a mustard cotton blouse with hand-embroidered edges, a color that matched the scarf Clara was wearing in the last photograph taken in Villa Ahumada. Extreme heat made work difficult, metal tools burned to the touch, and portable generators easily overheated. Still, every inch of the land was examined with soil scanners, soft bristled brushes, and DNA collection equipment. The well, dry for decades, contained at the bottom a sedimented layer of dust, bones, plant fragments, and small remains of personal objects that had survived the passage of time. Among them, a wristwatch with a worm-eaten leather strap, a metal medal with no visible inscription, and a partially damaged film of photographic film. The results of the first genetic analyses arrived on June 16th. The blood samples on the compass were compatible with bone remains found at the bottom of the well, and also with the genetic profile provided by Pablo's mother in 1997 as part of a transnational identification campaign. There was no doubt one of the bodies belonged to Pablo Ferrer Gomez. Days later, it was confirmed that the female skeletal remains, more fragmentary but with clear structural coincidences, corresponded to Clara Domenish-Batley. 31 years after they disappeared, their names returned to official records, this time as homicide victims. The family was informed through diplomatic channels. In Barcelona, the younger sister, who was 56 at the time, said she received the call with a mixture of relief and vertigo. The Spanish vice consul's voice was precise, almost surgical. He explained that the remains would be kept in Mexico until the judicial investigation was completed and that a controlled exhumation would be carried out. He told him about a compass, about long bones, about a sealed well. He told her almost at the end that there was a chance for justice. She didn't respond for several long seconds, then just murmured, "Thank you for not leaving them in silence." The Spanish Ministry of the Interior issued a brief statement without names. The Mexican government did not immediately comment, but local media began to circulate headlines about European tourists buried in the desert and the cursed well in Chihuahua. For days, local journalists crowded the perimeter of the discovery, taking photographs of mounds of earth, official vehicles, and the yellow tape marking the excavation area. No one yet imagined the magnitude of what was about to be revealed. The compass was classified as primary evidence. The PFG hand-engraved print was enlarged using forensic photography and presented as an unequivocal identifying element. The traces of blood found on the lid, combined with the position in which it was found, next to the edge of the well, partially covered by hand-placed stones, suggested that the object was intentionally discarded after the crime. The rusty iron bar, although deteriorated, showed impact marks and twist marks consistent with violent use. At one end, plant fibers and an embedded bone splinter were found. As the evidence grew, so did the pressure to find an explanation. The prosecutor's office opened a line of investigation focused on criminal activity in the region during the 1970s. Clandestine routes, coyote trafficking, petty trafficking, and paramilitary groups dissolved. That stretch of desert, devoid of territorial control, had been a no-man's land for years, and among its names one began to resonate with increasing force: Rodrigo Rafael Castañeda Villagran. Rodrigo Rafael Castañeda Villagran first appeared in official documents as a marginal note in a report by the then Judicial Police of the state of Chihuahua, dated 1973. It was a simple arrest for a street fight on the outskirts of Ciudad Juarez, with no significant legal consequences. However, upon digging into old files, investigators discovered that Castañeda, born in Torreon in 1952, had briefly served in the Mexican Army, only to be discharged under unclear circumstances in late 1972. Since then, he had operated in the shadows on the margins of legality, linked to informal networks involving border crossings, clandestine transportation, and minor extortion of migrants. One of the most revealing files was found in the blood collection of a Coahuila newspaper. A 1979 report that mentioned in a veiled way a certain Rafa Cia border patrolman accused of abandoning a group of Central Americans near Ojinaga. Although no criminal charges were ever filed, the name recurred in multiple testimonies from former Paleros who were retired or detained in the 1990s. They all agreed on one thing: Rodrigo had a reputation for being violent, unpredictable, and brutal in his methods. The final break came on July 24, 2005, when a man identified as Humberto Osuna Ledesma, a former collaborator of coyote trafficking networks and currently an inmate at the Aquiles Cerdán State Prison, agreed to give a statement under the protected witness mechanism. In a recorded testimony, Osuna stated that in the summer of 1974, while working with Castañeda in the desert region south of Sierra Blanca, Castañeda accidentally came across a foreign couple camping a few meters from a clandestine route used for illegal crossings. According to Osuna, Castañeda approached them with the intention of intimidating them and stealing supplies, but the situation got out of hand. He thought no one was there, one recounted, but when he approached, the boy stood up and shouted something at him. I don't know if he pushed him or something, but Rafa grabbed the bar he always carried in the truck and hit them both. It wasn't planned, but his hand didn't shake either. The testimony was verified by polygraph and cross-referenced with geographic records. Osuna precisely indicated the area where the incident occurred, a section coinciding with the well where the bodies were found. He also described Pablo's compass without having been previously informed of its existence. He called it the round clock with the letters marked on it. With these elements, the prosecution requested a search and arrest warrant. Rodrigo Castañeda, then 53 years old, lived in Monterrey under a real name, with no active criminal record. He worked as a night guard at an auto parts warehouse and lived alone in a rented room. He was arrested on February 3, 2006, in a joint operation between state and federal authorities without resisting. When interrogated, he refused to testify. He did not ask for a lawyer, nor did he show any signs of surprise. His silence was interpreted by some officers as a tacit confession. During the trial, Castañeda was formally charged with aggravated double homicide. The prosecution presented forensic evidence, testimony, and geographical reconstructions. The defense attempted to argue a lack of direct evidence, claiming that the remains were too deteriorated to support a specific charge. However, the correlation between the location, Osuna's testimony, the object with initials, and the genetic matches proved conclusive for the court. In August 2008, Rodrigo Castañeda was sentenced to 82 years in prison without the right to a reduction in his sentence. During the sentencing, the judge emphasized the cruelty, cowardice, and deliberate concealment of the crimes, as well as the monstrous indifference to the family's suffering for more than 3 decades. The sentence was celebrated by Clara's family as an act of justice that, although belated, brought closure to a cycle of deep-seated grief. Pablo's compass, after being presented as evidence during the trial, was handed over to Clara's sister during a private ceremony at the consular headquarters in Ciudad Juarez. The piece, still showing traces of rust, was placed inside a glass case and sent to Barcelona, where it remains to this day in the Dominic Ferrer Foundation for the Protection of Missing Travelers in Latin America. Created in 2012 as a response to a tragedy transformed into memory. That silent June of 2005, the desert that had been silent for 31 years finally began to speak. On February 3, 2006, at 6:45 in the morning, a joint unit of the Federal Investigation Agency and the Ministerial Police of Nuevo León quietly entered a side street in the industrial neighborhood in northeast Monterrey. The exact address had been confirmed hours earlier through a discreet surveillance operation initiated after the arrest warrant was issued by the Chihuahua prosecutor's office. Rodrigo Rafael Castañeda Villagran, 53, was sleeping on a folding bed in a small rented room attached to an auto parts warehouse where he worked as a night watchman. Upon his arrest, he offered no resistance. Castañeda didn't ask why he was being detained, nor did he protest. He simply sat on the edge of the bed, slowly put on his boots, and accepted being handcuffed without looking at the officers. During the transfer to the police station, he didn't say a word, merely staring out the window as if the cityscape were merely a foreign backdrop. The police report described his condition as absent, with no visible signs of emotional disturbance. His subsequent medical record confirmed what the officers already suspected. He suffered from hypertension, chronic insomnia, and mild cognitive impairment, likely associated with years of alcohol abuse and prolonged exposure to the sun and pesticides during rural work. But he was lucid and legally accountable. Once in Chihuahua, he was admitted to Social Rehabilitation Center No. 1. During the initial hearings, Castañeda refused to testify. His public defender attempted to delay his involvement with proceso, claiming that the defendant didn't clearly remember the events, and that she suffered episodic confusion. But the prosecution had more than memories. They had physical evidence, a genetic match, and incriminating testimony. The case was filed in the criminal court of the Morelos Judicial District under Case 17,326. The detailed forensic analysis of the skeletal remains, led by Dr. Ernesto Jaimes Diaz, confirmed multiple fractures in both bodies. Blunt force injuries to the skull, ribs, and jaw were consistent with direct and repeated attacks, possibly executed with an iron bar. In Clara's case, fractures were also found in her wrists and right radius, interpreted as attempts at self-defense. The date of death was established with a 10-day error range, between August 15th and 25th, 1974. The murder weapon, the curved bar found next to the remains, was sent to the forensic laboratory of the Attorney General's office, where metallographic tests were applied, revealing the presence of biological microtraces. Preserved in oxidized areas, blood particles, plant fibers, and dermal fragments. The object, although corroded, retained an intact section with grooves matching the shape of the right parietal bone of the male skull. Structural compatibility was presented in a three-dimensional animation before the court. This was one of the first times the state prosecutor's office used virtual reconstruction technology in a homicide trial. In parallel, the Swiss compass was studied by specialists from the National Institute of Criminal Sciences. Under electron scanning, the inscription PFG was confirmed as predating the general oxidation of the metal, ruling out the possibility of subsequent manipulation. The edges of the engraving showed remnants of epithelial skin, and one of the broken hinges had a microsplinter of a human fingernail. The correlation between this object, the remains, and Osun Ledesma's testimony created a complete forensic picture that did not require a confession. Prosecutors, led by Agent Silvia Lozoya Verdes, structured the accusation on three pillars: physical evidence, compass, remains, bar, criminal context, and a clandestine route active in 1974 with control. Castañeda's partial testimony and protected testimony with matching details. The georeferenced report also showed that the well where the bodies were found was located exactly 32 meters from the spot indicated by Ozuna in his statement, a margin of error of less than 10%. This information, corroborated by independent surveyors, was considered by the court as a conclusive indicator of the witness's direct knowledge of the event. Meanwhile, in Barcelona, Clara's family closely followed every development in the trial. Her younger sister, Mariona, traveled to Mexico City in March 2006 to meet with consular staff and attend the initial hearing remotely via video conference. That face framed by a gray scarf projected on the small screen in a courtroom became one of the most haunting moments of the proceedings. When offered the floor, she simply said, "More than 30 years have passed, but silence has not buried them." The phrase was recorded in the minutes and was reproduced the following day in a national newspaper. Under her image pixelated, the headline read, "Silence did not bury them." During the following months, the intermediate phase of the trial focused on consolidating the expert evidence, defining the lines of criminal responsibility, and determining the legal nature of the events. The prosecution, firm in its hypothesis of aggravated intentional homicide, argued that the crime was committed with extreme violence, treachery, and advantage. The bodies had not only been beaten to death, but also deliberately hidden, buried in a previously sealed pit, and located far from any common access routes. The location of the discovery suggested intimate knowledge of the terrain and a clear intention to avoid any possibility of discovery. The defense attempted to cast doubt on the solidity of the case. They questioned the chain of custody of the remains, the interpretation of Humberto Osuna's testimony, and the age of the objects found. They argued that there was no direct evidence placing Castañeda at the crime scene on the exact day of the events. The defense attorney, a young, court-appointed litigator, insisted on the lack of eyewitnesses and the over-reliance on evidence reconstructed with forensic technology. But each argument was refuted with meticulous precision. The forensic team, reinforced by experts from the National Institute of Forensic Medicine, presented a detailed chronology of events reconstructed from the remains, the objects, the sedimentation pattern, and the decomposition of organic materials. With the support of 3D models, they explained how the bodies were thrown into the pit in different positions, how the weight and compaction of the soil contributed to preserving some fragments, and how the progressive oxidation of the compass coincided with the environmental conditions and the passing of the seasons. One of the most striking moments occurred during the presentation of the partial fingerprint report. Although decomposition prevented obtaining complete prints, a fragment of a right phalanx preserved identifiable grooves that, through comparison with old records of Pablo Ferreira, obtained in Spain, allowed for additional confirmation of his identity. It was an unexpected, almost symbolic discovery, a partial print that survived time and the earth to irrefutably indicate that he had been there. A psychological profile was conducted in parallel. Castañeda's retrospective based on interviews with former acquaintances, a review of his behavioral patterns, previous medical evaluations, and an analysis of the criminal context of the 1970s in the north of the country. The report, prepared by forensic psychologist Maritza Anaya Beltran, described a subject with marked antisocial traits, a lack of empathy, a history of substance abuse, and impulsive behavior. He presented signs consistent with a schizoid personality with narcissistic components, she concluded. Although the diagnosis had no exculpatory value, it helped establish the degree of danger and coldness with which he would have acted. The hearings, held under strict security measures, were followed with growing interest by civil organizations. Some groups dedicated to the search for missing persons in Mexico began to attend as observers. Clara and Pablo's story resonated strongly because it synthesized, in its crudeness and long wait, institutional abandonment, prolonged impunity, and the silent power of an object that spoke again after decades of burial. On social networks, still in their infancy at that point, digital reconstructions of the compass, maps of the find, and old photographs of the couple began to circulate. In May, the prosecution presented its final key piece, indirect testimony from a now-retired rural doctor, Dr. Fortino Andrade, who stated that in August 1974, while working at a small clinic in Colomé del Sotol, he treated a man with a cut wound on his left hand. The man, who identified himself as Rafael, had a deep laceration with traces of metal oxide consistent, according to forensic experts, with an injury caused by improper or accidental use of a heavy object. The doctor did not sign an official report, but kept a consultation notebook with handwritten notes. One of them, dated August 17th of that year, read, R. Castaneda, wound metal bar, cleaning with alcohol, bandage. Although it did not constitute definitive evidence, the information reinforced the general chronology. Castaneda had been in the area during the same time period as the disappearance. The fact that he had concealed this information for decades was presented as further evidence of his sense of guilt. No other patient with that name had been registered in the region during that month. The court, composed of 3 judges, closed the evidentiary phase at the end of May. The parties were preparing for the final stage of the trial, which would determine not only Rodrigo Castaneda's guilt or innocence, but also the symbolic significance of a truth that took 31 years to emerge from the subsoil. A phrase from the deputy prosecutor during his final intervention was recorded in the minutes. In this case, it wasn't the voice that accused the murderer, it was the earth. The oral trial against Rodrigo Rafael Castaneda Villagran entered its concluding phase in early June 2006. The courtroom in Chihuahua was filled with a tension barely concealed by the judicial formalities. During the final sessions, the arguments of both sides became more precise, more surgical, as if each word could carry as much weight as evidence. Physical. The defense, increasingly cornered, attempted a last-ditch strategy to claim progressive mental deterioration, to claim partial non-imputability of the accused. They presented a private expert report suggesting mild neurological disorders resulting from possible early encephalopathy, but the counter-report from the Institute of Forensic Psychopathology was categorical. Castaneda fully understood the nature of his actions and his participation in the events. The sentence was read on July 6, 2006. The court unanimously found Rodrigo Castaneda guilty of double aggravated homicide. The reading took almost 2 hours. The presiding judge, with a calm, almost ceremonious voice, unpacked the elements of the case one by one, highlighting the brutality of the act, the long concealment of the bodies, and the sustained disregard for the truth. It has been proven that Mr. Castaneda caused the deaths of Clara Dominique Batley and Pablo Ferrer Gomez with full knowledge, deliberate intent, and with the intention of making their lives disappear. Traces in an environment of total lack of institutional protection. He stated, the sentence imposed was exemplary. 82 years in prison without the right to benefits, reductions, or early release. There were no shouts in the room, just a grave silence. Content, as if even justice had shame in the face of the abyss of waiting. Clara's sister, present via video call, received the news from a consulate office in Barcelona. For several minutes he was unable to speak. He held up a photograph of Clara framed in light wood, the same one he had brought to every meeting with diplomats for more than 30 years. When he finally broke the silence, he said softly, "It took them so long to find her." But she wasn't alone. He stayed with her until the end. Shortly after, the Spanish state, through its diplomatic representation, began the formal procedure to repatriate the remains. However, the family decided not to move. Clara and Pablo would be buried together on Mexican soil in a small cemetery near Villa Ahumada, the same town from which they had left without knowing they would never return. The ceremony took place on July 27, 2006, with the presence of both families, several journalists, and representatives of civil organizations. On the simple white gravestone, a single phrase was engraved, "Found together at last in silence." The case was widely covered by the Mexican and Spanish press. What had been an invisible event in the 1970s became, 3 decades later, a necessary reference in the debate on disappearances, transnational justice, and posthumous dignity. The impact of the process went beyond the boundaries of the file. Several academic articles were published in subsequent months, analyzing the combined use of forensic technology and protected testimony in long-standing cases. For many, he became an example of what can be achieved when the truth is pursued with perseverance, even beyond a generation. In a parallel, the compass once again occupied the symbolic center of the story. In August, it was displayed for a few days in the lobby of the Chihuahua Institute of Forensic Sciences, alongside a reproduction of the map Clara had drawn by hand in her travel notebook. The clumsily but indelibly engraved PFG inscription became an involuntary emblem of resilient memory. There were those who proposed moving it to a memorial museum. Others suggested that it remain in the family's custody. It was finally handed over to the Dominic Ferrer Foundation, established that same year as a nonprofit organization based in Barcelona. Its mission is to advise, accompany, and highlight the cases of missing tourists and travelers in Latin America. In subsequent interviews, Mariona Dominique spoke calmly, without anger or euphoria. "I didn't want revenge, just to know what happened to them. And now I know. She loved him until the end. He didn't leave her. He also died for not abandoning her." The words struck a chord. That crime, with its bones, its well, its rusty compass, and its aging killer, had also left a lesson. That even in places where justice is not expected, sometimes it is the earth that returns it. Rodrigo Castañeda was transferred months later to the federal prison in Hermosillo. He lives in a single cell. He has not given interviews or shown remorse. His medical record indicates intermittent episodes of confusion, but no severe alterations of consciousness. Receives an annual visit from a distant nephew. In the inmate registry, their status remains active. Convicted of double homicide with aggravating circumstances, without legal benefit, his name appears in small print at the end of a list. Where bureaucracy ends, oblivion begins. But not for Clara, not for Pablo, and not for those who learned from her story that silence is never final. The final ruling against Rodrigo Castañeda in 2006 did not mark the end of the case, but rather the beginning of a new phase, reconstructing a living memory, a truth that would not be limited to the court file. In 2007, after several months of negotiations, Clara and Pablo's family obtained authorization from the municipal government of Villa Amada to install a small memorial plaque at the exact spot where the compass was found next to the mouth of the sealed well. The vacant and forgotten land for decades was cleaned up by local volunteers. White stones were placed around the perimeter, along with a rusty metal cross salvaged from a blacksmith's workshop and a marble plaque with a simple inscription. Here, silence began to speak. Clara and Pablo, August 1974, June 2005. The laying ceremony took place in April 2007, with the presence of both families, members of organizations searching for missing persons, Spanish consular staff, and several community residents. There were no television cameras, no grandiloquent speeches, just a warm, steady wind that whipped through hats and dresses, seemingly wanting to erase, as it had done so many times before, everything the earth had yet to give back. Clara's sister, Mariona, placed a small black and white photo on the stone. It was the last one they had together, taken in Tijuana. Weeks before the disappearance, she didn't cry, nor did she speak. She just stood looking at the already sealed well, like someone listening to something that others can't hear. That same year, the Dominic Ferrer Foundation was officially registered in Barcelona as a nonprofit organization. Its initial mission was to provide legal, emotional, and logistical support to families of missing European travelers in Latin America. What began as a gesture of remembrance eventually became a network of international collaboration. By 2010, the foundation had documented more than 40 similar cases in Mexico, Guatemala, Colombia, and Peru, helping in some cases establish contact with authorities, exert diplomatic pressure, or reactivate forgotten files. His work was cited in reports by the European Parliament and received with respect, though not much fanfare, in various international forums. Pablo's compass, which became a central symbol of that memory, was briefly displayed at the Autonomous University of Barcelona in an exhibition titled Objects That Returned, along with other items found in graves, rivers, or desert roads. The piece, still with visible stains of rust and dried blood, was placed inside a glass case on an aged wooden base. Beside it, a plaque explained its discovery, the couple's story, and the object's legal significance. Many attendees, unaware of the details of the case, paused for long minutes in silence before the compass, as if they sensed in that worn piece the persistence of something greater than crime, fidelity, memory, the companionship that yields neither to fear nor death. In parallel, Castañeda's trial began to be cited in criminology seminars. As one of the first Mexican cases in which a sentence was obtained for a crime committed more than 30 years ago, based on forensic evidence and high-precision geographic reconstruction. The Chihuahua prosecutor's office prepared a technical report on the case, distributed internally as an example of best practices for long-running investigations. The combination of found objects, protected testimony, genetic analysis, and documentary memory maintained by the family was described as a robust structure of symbolic litigation. Yet no official institution offered an apology for the state's original inaction. In 2011, journalist Javier Martín Cobo published the book A Compass for Silence in Spain, a detailed account of the case that reconstructed not only the facts, but also the institutional void that allowed the crime to remain hidden for more than 3 decades. The text was acclaimed for its rigor and sobriety, far removed from the usual sensationalism. It has been translated into French and Italian, and has been used as required reading in at least 2 master's programs on human rights at European universities. The story was no longer just a private tragedy. It had become a warning, an open question, a shared wound. At the end of 2012, the Chihuahua state government, at the initiative of a local representative, proposed including a symbolic mention of the case in the state memorial for victims of disappearance. Although the proposal was voted on by a majority, it was never physically implemented. The project was shelved due to lack of budget. However, a pencil note remained next to a circle on the desert map on the original plans. Clara and Pablo, well compass, justice. At the entrance to the foundation in Barcelona, on a discreet shelf, remains a framed enlarged copy of the compass. It has no shine, it is not polished, it is preserved exactly as it was found under glass. A phrase engraved in Latin accompanies it. Veritas ex silencio, the truth from silence. And even though no one passes through the desert to see her, she is still there. It doesn't point north, but it points to something deeper, the exact place where 2 names conquered oblivion. Nearly a decade after their discovery and 39 years after their disappearance, the case of Clara Dominic Batlle and Pablo Ferrer Gomez has ceased to be merely an individual tragedy and has become a silent mark on the map of memory. The sealed well in the middle of the desert was not a closure, but threshold. From it emerged other searches, other names, other rusty compasses that also waited to be heard. But not all objects speak. Not all silences find an echo. In 2013, a delegation from the International Committee Against Enforced Disappearances visited Chihuahua to evaluate regional protocols. Although the case was no longer listed in the active files, one of the representatives requested a visit to the discovery site. He did it alone, without entourage or cameras. He stood for a few minutes in front of the rusty iron cross. He took note, and before leaving he left among the stones a small white flower wrapped in paper with a handwritten message. There is no land more alive than that which returns what silence has buried. Today, very few remember the name Rodrigo Castañeda. His aging face is not reported in the news, nor is his prison number listed in public reports. He died in prison in 2021 in total anonymity. No family claimed his body. He was buried in a mass grave with a number that has since been washed away by the rain. But Clara and Pablo are still there in Villa Ahumada, under an immense sky that no longer threatens oblivion. Together as they always were, as they resisted, as they died.